Keycloak is an identity administrative management system. It's an open source software that was built with Java and is being currently developed by the Red Hat community. And in this video, I'll be walking you through details step by step on how to set up Keycloak, configure it, and then integrate it with Spring Oauth2 applications. The Spring Oauth2 applications we are going to be working with include the Spring Oauth2 Resource Server application and a Spring Oauth2 client application. Welcome to IoCodes, and I am Isaiah. And if you are coming across this channel for the first time, please do well to subscribe to this channel, ping that bell icon, and give this video a thumbs up to help the YouTube algorithm. Now, without much further ado, let's jump right in to Keycloak. Now, to get started, we want to open up our browser, and then we are going to move over to keycloak.org/downloads. We are going to download the zip file for the Keycloak distribution. So you have to click on this to download that zip file. I already have this downloaded, so I don't have to do that again. Then again, while your Keycloak distribution is downloading, you want to simply move over to start.spring.io to bootstrap the two different Spring applications we're going to be using to demonstrate how to integrate Keycloak. I'll make my version on 3.4.3, and we want to change our group ID. So for me, it should be com.iocodes.web, and for the artifact, I'm going to have OAuth2 resource demo, and let me add that to right here. And now I'll simply take out this part from my package name. I'll leave as jar, and we have a version as Java 21. You can make use of 17 or 24. It just depends on what you prefer. Now for this project, we are making use of the Gradle build tool and the Groovy distribution, or the Groovy version of it. And we are going to select a couple of dependencies, starting with web. Since it's going to be a web application, then we need Spring security as well. So I'll add that. And finally, we are going to make use of the OAuth2 resource server dependency. So these are the three dependencies we need. I'll simply click on enter to control and enter to generate our Spring Boot project file. Now, since we now have that of the resource demo, we can change this part and make it client. Okay, and I'll take out this part for the package name as well. I just need com.iocodes.web. Now I want to remove the resource server dependency and replace that with the client dependency. So this should be OAuth2 client, control and enter, and we can simply escape this. So with this, we have our two Spring Boot bootstrapped project downloaded. Okay, so I'll simply close this, and I believe by now the download of Keycloak should be already done on your part. Now in the next two videos for the release train of this month, the next two videos for this month, we're going to be looking at Docker, and in that video we are going to be building a Spring Boot Docker image, and we're going to be integrating with the official Keycloak container. Instead of having to download it on our PC, we are going to make use of Docker to pull the image from the Docker repository. More on that video. And if you want to know the next video that will be on the release train, please do check out my first video for the month, which happens to be the release train video for the month. Right now, inside of my downloads directory, we can see the OAuth2 resource demo, the client, as well as our Keycloak distribution. So what I'll simply do is extract Keycloak with 7-zip, and I'll extract it here to be in the download directory. And I'll repeat the same for our client demo and our client our resource demo and our client demo as well. So extract here. So we have both of them extracted. So right now I'm going to open up Keycloak, and I want to open up the terminal from this directory. I have Git Bash already installed in my PC, and if you don't have Git Bash already, you have the terminal, that's Windows terminal. You can simply hold on the shift key and right click and you'll be presented with an option to open either the PowerShell window or Linux shell or the terminal as the case may be for you. I'll make use of Git bash, and right now I want to start up the Keycloak development server. So to do that, we want to first of all move over to the bin directory, and after which we want to start the kc.sh, and we're going to have start dev as the command that we're going to pass to this particular shell file before getting it started. Now click on enter to start our Keycloak instance. So now our Keycloak instance is up and running, and we can see a statement that was printed out on the terminal that we are simply running this server in development mode, and we cannot use this configuration in production mode. In the coming video where we pull the Keycloak image using our Docker, we are going to see how to configure Keycloak in a much more production oriented way, where we are going to make use of a persistent database and not an in-memory database. That is one. And now we can also see that our server is listening on the port 8080. So we're going to open up our browser. Then we are going to head on to localhost at port 8080. And then we are going to configure credential for a temporary administrative user at first. So this should be admin, admin, and admin again. So I'll simply create this user. And then I want to open the administrative console. So to open the administrative console, we have to log in with the credentials of the user we just created. And here we are going to be presented with the page of the administrative console. For now, we have a rem, which is the default rem that Keycloak automatically creates, and that is the master rem. And we also have this current user, which happens to be the admin, and we can see that we have a log statement at the top. We are logged in as a temporary admin user. Also, adding security, we have to create a permanent account and delete the temporary one. So before we go ahead and create a temporary admin user, a permanent admin user, we want to look at the list of users in this current frame. Right now we have one, which happens to be our temporary user. We'll go ahead now and add a new user. So this should be new underscore admin, and I'll simply go ahead. Oops, my bad. I'll simply take that out. This is required user actions, but I'll paste that new admin right here as the username. So now I can go ahead and create my user. The next thing I want to do is assign a credential, which happens to be the password for this user. So I'll set the password, and right here we are going to have new underscore admin. Okay, and this password should not be temporary, it should be a permanent password. And I'll simply go ahead and save. I have to save the password. No thanks. Now finally, we want to move back to our list of users, and right now this admin has a list of roles. So we can see that we have default roles master and admin roles for the temporary user we created. So we want to move back and assign these roles to this new user we've created. So by default, we have the default role master as one of the roles. So we're going to click on assign role, and we want to search for the role of admin. Enter. And we don't have that, so we want to filter by rem roles instead. So right here we have the admin role. So I'll simply click on this, and I will assign it to our new admin user. So with all of this done, we can simply log out now and log in with our new admin credentials. So this should be new admin, and let me fix that. We are going to go ahead and sign in. So this should be okay. Now that we have new admin as the new signed in user, we can go ahead and delete the previous one. So this should be delete user, and we delete the user. So you have to ensure that you follow all of those steps and even assign the admin role to your new permanent user in order for you to be able to view the master or perhaps the administrative console. So we want to go ahead now and just quickly do a little more change. And let's see, we have email verified turned off, but now I want to change it to the value of on, and we'll simply save. And before we go ahead and start implementing Keycloak for our Spring Boot application, let's quickly take a close look at some of the concepts that makes Keycloak and how they are being defined. When we started our Keycloak instance a few moments ago, we were presented with a default realm which is known as the master realm, and we accessed that realm using a temporary credential that was created just for development purposes alone. Now, a realm is a fundamental organization unit that manages users, credentials, roles, and groups within an authentication and authorization domain. Just to give you a proper illustration, I want you to think of a realm as an organization. This is due to the fact that realms can contain multiple clients. And for the sake and the purpose of this tutorial, we are going to be having a single realm which will be called the IO organization. Now, in order for us to make proper use of this our defined realm, we'll have to go ahead and consider the different departments that can make up our organization. Let's take for instance the IT department, the HR department, as well as the finance department. These are all departments that falls under an organization. The IO code organization as an example. Now in Keycloak, a client is an application or service that interacts with the identity management system, which we already know that as the definition of Keycloak, to authenticate users and manage access permissions. And each client represents a distinct business application, while views and functionalities within that application are controlled using rules and policies rather than separate clients. So let us consider different pages or different resources in our application. Now, based on the rules of the different user we have in this organization, we can determine what and what can be viewable by that user, or what and what can be accessible to that particular user. Now, just for demonstration purposes, I have went ahead and defined three different clients, which includes the IT department, the HR department, and the finance department, just for illustration purposes. However, this is not how it has been implemented in the application. What I practically did was just create a single client, or what we'll be doing is creating a single client and using these clients to demonstrate the possibilities of multiple clients in a Keycloak realm. Now, this practically would be the underlying structure of our organization with its three different clients. But there's something I want to quickly point out, and that is in real world applications, we want to ensure that we prevent something like this. This is because all of these can simply be collapsed into a single client, and we can simply have multiple rules to determine or define what can be accessible by the different users with those different roles. So we can have an admin for the IT department, um, having a prefix IT underscore admin, and an admin for the HR department having a prefix HRO underscore admin, as the case may be. However, in order for us to make proper use of our client, or in order for our department to be properly structured, we definitely need to have members or users of the client. So just for illustration purpose, we have just few members being shown on the screen, and we can see that at the topmost of this different member, we have the admin, or I'll put it as the manager. So the admin of these different departments have access to some resources or to some policies that other users or other members of the department will not have access to. So this is just the bare basic or the bare minimum explanation of Keycloak and how to set it up. Now, depending on how our client scope has been defined, we can determine what and what will be seen by the admin and what will be seen by the user. So without much further ado, let us quickly take a close look on how to implement all of this inside of our Keycloak instance. Having seen that brief explanation of Keycloak, the very first thing we want to do is to go ahead now and create a new realm. So the name of our realm would simply be IOCodes.org, which is IOCodes organization. I'll simply go ahead now and create this realm. Now that we've created our realm, we want to go ahead now and create a client. So by default, these are lists of the clients that we already have, but all of these clients are not what we are going to be making use of. These are default clients that are created automatically when a new realm is created. So we want to go ahead now and create a new client. We are going to give this client ID IO code client, and we want to click on next. Oops, my bad. Client ID, and for the name we are going to say IO code client, and then we click on next. We'll leave this as is, and then we'll go ahead and click on next again. And for this, we want to provide a valid redirect URI. So I'll make use of localhost 8080 slash asterisk. I'll repeat that same URL for the valid post logout redirect URI. And for that of the web origins, we are going to make use of this. Okay. And now we simply save this. Now this client that I have created do not require any credential to access the realm. Okay, so now that we've done this, we can move over to the realm settings so that I can point out something to you. Right here, we have the endpoints and we have the OpenID endpoints configuration. So when I click on this link, it brings me to this page that returns a JSON object. Here we can see the issuer. So the issuer of any token that will be gotten would be from the IO code aux realm, as can be seen right here. And for the authorization endpoint, we have that as well. And one thing I want you to take a close look at is the grant types that is supported by this realm. This grant type include the authorization code grant type, implicit, refresh token, password, credentials, and this other two, which I pretty much don't know what they entail at the moment. What I'm trying to point at is that if you've seen the previous video I have on the channel, or you have any experience with OAuth2, you'll have come across the all of this. These values right here are what we are going to be imputing into our Spring Boot application in order for us to properly configure it with Keycloak. Not all of the values, but some of the values. Now we can simply close this and move back to our administrative console. Now that we've created a client, we can simply view the client, and we want to go ahead now and create roles for this client. So I'm going to create two roles, starting with the admin role. Simply save this, and I'll go back to client details. I'll create a new role, and this should be, oops, not this. Let's simply cancel this or delete this. Okay, so I'll create the role again. Should be user, and then I'll save. So these are basically the two roles I just need based on the demonstration we saw a few minutes ago. So now the next thing now is to move back to our client, and we are going to create a couple of users, starting with this first user. So we're going to have iocodes underscore admin. Okay, and I'll simply create this user, and email verified should be on, and we want to assign a credential to this user. So right now, just to make things simple, I'm going to give it a user password of admin, and then I'll save. I'm going to repeat the same thing, but then again, we are going to be making use of a new user, which should be iocodes underscore user, just to illustrate that it's a user. Email verified is true, and we'll simply go ahead and create this user, and email verified is okay. I did that already, and we can simply save this user. So now we want to assign a role to this user. We are going to assign this role by the client. So I'm going to search for user. Let's simply assign this role, and voila. We repeat the same thing for the IO code admin. So this should be role mapping. Assign role. I want to search for admin. And if you observe carefully, you see that this role is coming from the client called the IO codes client, which is a client we created just now. So I'm going to assign this role, the admin, to IO codes admin user. So now we'll move back to our list of users. And previously I failed to set the credential of our user. So that is our IO codes user. So we have to set the password now. And in this case, the password is simply user, just to make me easily remember that IO codes user has the role of a user. So that is it. And now we want to move back to our client, and we've assigned two users to this client based on the role we passed to the users that was created in our realm. So I'll move to iocodes client. I want to take a close look at our client scope. Now, right inside of our client scope, we want to switch from the setup tab to the evaluate tab. But before we do that, I want us to quickly take a close look at what we have here. We now have a new client scope that was created automatically and dedicated to this client. So if I'm to click on it, we'll see that we have no defined mappers. Though this client scope was created, we can still go ahead and create the scope for this client. Okay, so I'll simply toggle that back. But before then, we want to move back and we want to click on this evaluate tab. So when you click on this evaluate tab, we can simply search for users, and let's look at the IO codes admin. I want to see the kind of token that is generated automatically. So when I click on generated access token, so this would be the different values of the claims that can be gotten from the JWT token that is being sent over to our application. So you can see that right here we have the resource access, and inside of the resource access is the name of our client, followed by the roles and followed by the list of roles associated with this client, which is the admin. We have the account as well, and we have the scope, and we also have email verified as true, and a preferred username is the name of our user, including the type of token and so on and so forth. You can take a close look at that. And when I change this value to the user, I kind of have to switch between this. So let's move back to generated access token. We can see now that the roles has changed to user, and the preferred username, let's see if I'll have that, is iocodes user. So that is that. Now we can simply post any changes we want to make to our Keycloak Realm and go ahead and start the development of our Spring Boot application, and after which we can come forth and back and make changes when necessary to our realm and our clients respectively. So right now we want to start off with the development of our resource server at first. So I'm simply going to right click on it and open folder as IntelliJ community edition project. So let's expand this full screen, and I'll go ahead and at first I'll simply create a new um, package, or simply a directory that I'll call component, that contains all the components of this project. So let's give it some time for it to import all of our dependencies. So if we move over to our gradle.build file, it's going to bring all of this dependency from the Maven repository. So it's going to take a while for that. And after which we can simply go ahead and create the different classes that will make up our application. Okay, we're almost there. So right now, as you can see, we have our components now in the package kind of structured. So we collapse this again. At first, we are going to start off with a new Java class, which would be our controller. So this should be auth insert Java class, and I'll call this demo controller. That is one. The next would be a simple entity class, or a simple Pojo class, which would be a person class, just providing details or feeds for a particular person. And finally, for now, we're going to create a security config class. So these are the three different classes we want to create at first. Now, starting with that of the person class, we want to define a couple of feeds, which should just be the private string name. I'll have to type that in. The next should be private int age. So let's change this to email instead. Okay. So now I have defined all the fields in the person class. What we want to do now is to define our constructor. Now I have this plugin, as you can see right inside of my IntelliJ IDE, called Tab9, which is an AI agent that automatically gives suggestion on the next code to impute inside of your class or your code base, as the case may be. So I'll simply tab this in. Now we have the complete constructor of the person. Now we can go ahead now and take all the getters and setters this plugin is generating for me. It's my bad. And let's see what is it that I'm missing. So I have to take that out. And now we have the main constructor with all of the elements. What we want now is the default constructor. So this should be public. And we're going to have person. And right here we have it. So the next now is the setters and getters of the different fields in this class. So I'll tab this in. That's for the name, for the email, and finally for the age. Because I want it to look much more structured, I'll cut this part out and paste it right here at the top. So now we are done with our person object or our person class. And moving to our demo controller, we want to create our controller at first by annotating with at rest controller. And right here, we are going to simply create a simple get endpoint. So I'll tab this in. And we have the LO endpoint, and I want to wrap this in a response entity. You can do it either way by just returning a string, but just I feel like wrapping it in a response entity, so I'll go ahead with what I feel like doing. And let's correct this. So we're going to have response entity dot okay, and we pass in the string hello. And this wouldn't be word, but let's just leave it as is for now. Okay. And now right here we want to pass in the instance of the authentication object, that is the authenticated entity. So I'll tab this in, and we can simply import the class from springframework.security.core package. Okay. Let's tap this bit in. Here we are going to log out details from our authenticated object, and the details we want to log out, my bad, this should be log.info, and this should be a string authorities, should be user authorities, comma, and it should be authentication.get authorities. So now that is it. I'll end that with a semicolon. And in order for us to ensure that a user is authenticated before trying to access this endpoint, we want to simply move on to our security config class and provide the configuration for that. At first, we are going to be annotating this class with enable web security, followed by at configuration. Okay, not all of those. And now we want to define a bean of Spring security filter chain, so it overrides the one that has already been defined by Spring security automatically. So we're going to have bean, okay, throws an exception, tab in and enter. I will pass in our HTTP security HTTP. We'll have to import the class. So right now we are simply going to return http.build. Okay. But before we do that, we have to provide the necessary configurations. At first, we want to simply define dot authorize, sorry, not this. Okay. We can do this at first. So we're going to have auth, and right now I want to say auth dot any request dot authenticated. And yet this is just the configuration that we need to ensure that all requests to our resource server is authenticated. However, we want to also ensure that we've provided the necessary configuration to ensure that our resource server gets configuration details directly from our Keycloak Realm. So in order for us to do that, we want to move on to our resource directory. So inside of the application or properties file, we are going to add a new Spring or a new application property. And that application property is our OAuth2 resource server JWT issuer URL, which happens to be our realm. So to do that, we are going to have spring.security OAuth2 resource server .jwt issuer .uri. It's not .uri but -uri, and this should be equal to, remember that we have our realm hosted on localhost, that is our Keycloak instance on port 8080. So this should be http, tab that in, we're going to have 8080 slash the name of our realm. But before that, we are going to have realms at first. So this should be realm slash IO codes org. Okay, so that is for the resource server, the resource server issuer URI. But then again, we also need the JWT set URL. So we are going to move on to our browser again, and right inside of our Keycloak administrative console, we want to move back to the realm settings, and I want to open this endpoint so that we can get the correct URL for the JWT, for the JWK set. Okay, and this should be it. I think so. It should be JWKSURI. So I'm going to highlight the whole of this Okay, Control C, and then I'll move back to my application.properties file. So I'm gonna have JWK set URI equal to this value. Here you see we still have the realms, the name of our realm, followed by the protocol, followed by OpenID Connect, followed by set. I want to inject this value right into our security config class. So we're going to be doing that with the use of the @value annotation. So this should be @value, and let's have our string. We import this. So I have JWK set, my bad, set URI, and that's with that's curly brace, and this should be private string JWK set URI. Now, for us to properly ensure that, we want to make use of the OIdcUserService resource server of our HTTP. So this should be http.oauth2 resource server. Now we're going to pass a JWT instance. Correct. So this should be no. It should be OAuth2. And now we are going to have OAuth2 dot JWT. And yeah, we're going to pass in another lambda expression. So this should be JWT. Okay. I have JWT dot set, sorry, JWK set URI, and we'll pass in that value. I'll simply end the whole of this with a semicolon. So I'll delete that extra line. And yet this is exactly what we need to set up our Spring Authorization server. So I'll simply go ahead now, and inside of my controller class, I want to annotate with at get mapping again a new endpoint, and this should be to the slash persons endpoint. Okay, and this should be public. We're gonna have a response entity of let's say a person. Okay, I'll simply call this get persons, or perhaps I'll just simply call it persons. Okay, let's tab and do the job for us. So I'll tab this all in. So we have a new person, the name, and we want an email to be specified as well. So this should be john@gmail.com, just for demonstration purposes. And now, since we want to ensure that only users with the role of an admin can access this page or this method, and we haven't really provided that inside of our security filter chain, we can move back to our controller class and annotate this controller class with @enable enable method security. And right here we want to annotate our method with @preauthorize. Okay, we want to pass in the string as role. In this case, we are going to use a single quote, as role admin. We end with our with our double quote. So this is for users with the roles of an admin. Now, with this definition we have right here, only users with the role of an admin would be able to call the slash persons endpoint. So now let's quickly move to our application.properties file, and by default we know that Spring will automatically start our application at the port 8080, and we want to prevent that because Keycloak is already running at that port. So we are going to have server.port, and we set this port equal to a value of 7070. Okay, so that is it. And now we can simply start our resource server. So I'll go ahead and click on this run icon, and now I'll be starting up Postman as well. So we're going to have Postman. Now our application has started running on our desired port, which is 7070, as you can see right here. And Postman as well has been opened up. But before we go ahead and request for an authorization token from the token endpoint of our authorization server, let us quickly take a close look at this simple curl command. I've compiled this command and I'll be providing it in the description section so that you can simply go ahead and copy this command and send a request with your terminal if you don't have Postman. But it's advisable that you have Postman just for carrying out tests to the different endpoints. So we see the different values that is sent in form URL encoded. We have the grant type, the client ID, username, password, as well as the scope. And here the grant type has been set to password, and you can see that our client ID is the client ID for the client we created inside of our REM. Take note of that, which happens to be the IO code aux REM. And then we specify the user that is trying to access or get a token. And then we pass in the password and also specify the scope as open ID. So I'm simply going to go back to Postman, and right here we still have a couple of feed or perhaps request form URL encoded instances or objects that we are not including in this section. We're going to be doing that when we take a close look at requesting of code using an authorization, requesting of a token using an authorization code. Now we have the client ID, redirect URL, username, password, and the grant type. So I'll simply go ahead now and send this request to our token endpoint. So right here we have our access token. I'm simply going to highlight the whole of this access token. I'll copy it, and we want to move on to a new get request. So right here we're going to have 7070 slash hello endpoint. I think that's what we have for now. And for the authorization, we're going to choose Bearer. So let's move on to Bearer. And right here, I want to paste our token. Okay, so this is the token we've retrieved from the authorization server. Now, I'll simply go ahead now and firstly, let's make use of no auth. And when I send, we're going to have a 403, 401 unauthorized, not a 403, but a 401. Then we'll move over to that of the bearer token, and I'll simply send the request this time around, and we should get a 200 OK as we have it right here and our hello world. Let's quickly take a close look at our application. So this is it right here. I want to see the authorities that we've printed out inside of our controller, which was right here. So from our authorities, we have the scope of email and we have the scope of profile. So how are we going to ensure that the user with an admin would be able to access this endpoint, that's the slash person's endpoint, if the authorities we have here is just from our scope? We can go ahead and define a JWT converter, but before we go ahead and define this converter, let's quickly move back to our Keycloak instance, and right inside of the clients that we've created, we move back to the client scope and then we evaluate the token. So from our admin user, we want to see how the generated access token looks like one more time. So we have the resource access, the IO codes client, before we can access the roles that is associated with this particular user. And for us to make things a little bit much more easier, instead of having to traverse through till we get to the defined roles that we want to move to our setup, and we want to apply changes to this dedicated client scope that has been assigned to our IO codes client. So I'll click on it and we want to configure a new mapper. So we'll look for the user client role and we want to assign a name to this mapper called authorities, which I'll do. And the prefix to these authorities will simply be role because that is what Spring automatically use to assign roles or to determine the role assigned to a particular user. So we have to include that prefix right here. And our token claim values should be the authorities. I'll simply go ahead now and save this value. Now I want to move back to the previous page to our client's details. We want to go back to evaluate again. After which we select our admin user and we want to look at the generated access token. So now if we take a close look now, this time around we have the authorities and we have the role admin. And the other authorities include manage accounts, view profile, and manage account links, which are simply roles that are associated with the account. And all of this falls inside of the client, as you can see right here. Okay, so now with all of this all said and done, we can move back to our Spring Boot application to define our JWT converter component. So this should be auth insert. We have a JWT converter class. Now that we've defined the class, before anything, we have to annotate with that component so that Spring automatically creates an instance of this class for us and manages the life cycle of this instance. Okay, so the next thing for us to do now is to simply at first stop our running server. And now we want to implement the converter interface. So this should be implement. We have converter and it takes in JWT followed by abstract authentication token. I'll have to enter that and then I'll have to import the class as well as our converter. And finally, we want to implement the convert method. So that should be just what we need. So I'm going to change this to JWT source so it's kind of understandable because we're getting it from the source. So basically what we want to do is to convert from the default JWT authentication token that will be gotten from our JWT claim in a way that it includes the authorities from the authorities we've defined or extracted from our Keycloak realm. Let me collapse this and then we can go ahead and implement all of this. So firstly, we're going to have a var of authorities and this should be equal to the JWT source.get claim. And remember that the name of the claim we've given was authorities. So take note of that. Now this is going to be a list. So we have to as well concatenate this value. So this should be string. And we have to import our list class. Let's do that. And right here, we simply want to wrap the whole of this. And not this list class, but the one from the java.util package. Okay, so that is that. The next thing we want to do now is to get hold of the list of previously granted authorities that is being inferred by Spring Security automatically. And to achieve that, we are going to say var granted authorities, and this should be equal to a new instance of JWT. I said Java. JWT granted authorities converter dot convert, and we pass in our JWT source. I'll type that in and end with a semicolon. And before we go any further, let us quickly take a close look at what we have for the convert method that is being defined in this class. We can see that it returns a value of granted authorities, which happens to be a collection of this value. And Just like our JWT Converter, this class as well, implements the converter interface. However, unlike our own definition of scenario, it returns a collection of granted authorities. So this is the collection of granted authorities that Spring Security can infer to provide security policies to some particular endpoints of the application. Now what we want to do now is to add these two authorities together. In order for us to do that, we want to at first check that the authorities that we've gotten from our claim is not equal to null. So that should be if authorities is not equal to null. And you can simply go ahead and add all of these authorities. So right here we have granted authorities of add all, but now we want to see process user authorities, and then we're going to pass in authorities as the value. Now the reason for this method that we want to define, or the function we want to define, is because the authorities that is being gotten from our claim happens to be a list. However, the granted authorities is a collection of granted authority. I want to take note of that. So we have to convert this at first to a collection of granted authority so that we can go ahead and add all of it. So now we want to define that method, and right here we simply go ahead and return this value. We have authorities dot stream, and then we map the value to a simple granted authority, and we can simply go ahead and pass in new. I want to collect all of this value to a list, as the case may be. You can do to set or to list, just depending on what you prefer. So now I have this, and we can see now that we are returning null. We want to change that. I want to return granted authorities instead. Not granted authorities, but pardon me, but something else. We are going to have JWT new JWT authentication token. Take this part out. So we have JWT source followed by a comma followed by JWT source.get subject. And so this is basically what we need. Now, in order for us to be able to make use of this JWT converter we've defined, we want to check out our security config class and inject it inside of it and apply the configuration to our OAuth2 resource server HTTP kind of login method. So now we are going to auto wire that instance. So it should be right here. We're going to tab this in. It's not this, but JWT converter. And because we have to set another property, we want to impute all of them inside of a curly brace. So we're going to have JWT authentication converter, and then we'll pass in this converter that we have defined. We end everything with a semicolon. Now this is all the configuration that is needed. So we can simply go ahead now and start up our resource demo application. So I'll click on this, and I want to be sure that Postman is still up and running. So I'll have to reload to be sure of that. Okay, we are still in good hands. I'll move back to Postman. Then we have this. Well, we are going to send a request to get a token again. So I'll simply send. Then I'll highlight the whole of this. I'm moving back to our get endpoint. We want to change this token to this one. I'll simply go ahead now and send this request. So here we have a 200 OK. I'd love us to see the list of authorities that have been printed out onto the console or log that onto the console. So we can see that we have the scope image, scope profile. Now we now have the role admin, and we also have the role manage account, and so on and so forth. These are the roles automatically that we've configured from Keycloak. Now we can simply go ahead now and send a request to the slash person's endpoint with our user admin. So back to this, we are going to have persons, and then I'll click on send. So we have this for this particular user. But how about in a scenario whereby we change the value from admin to user? Okay, and the password would be user as well. So when I send this request, we are going to get an access token. Okay, it says invalid grant type account is not fully set. And this is something I want to point out. When you come across a scenario like this, you want to move over to your Keycloak realm. Let's move over to the user, IO user, and we can see that a required user action is here, which happens to be update password. So I'll click on this to remove this action, move over to credential. Let's see what we have here, and everything is set. So we'll move back to Postman, move back to user. I'll have to save at first. Then we'll move back to Postman and send the request again. So we have this token. So I'll add the whole of this token. Control C, move on to this, and let's update our token. Now I'll send. We're going to have a 401 unauthorized. Okay, we have a 403 forbidden. The reason is because this particular user is forbidden to access that endpoint due to the fact that the role that has been defined for our user is the role of a user. So we are going to send a request now to the LO endpoint using that token. So our user can access this endpoint, and we will see that the role happens to be of user. So that is that for our resource demo. Now with the same configuration in place, let us quickly take a close look at how to implement this for a Spring Oauth2 resource client application. Now I've also gone ahead now and open our client demo, and we can see that we have something similar with our resource demo, which we worked on a few moments ago. So we have the persons class, we have our demo controller still implemented the same way. However, I want to point something out. When we are dealing with clients as such, we most time are dealing with Spring MVC, a complete Spring MVC application that makes use of a templating engine such as Timeleaf, JSP, as the case may be. We simply return a REST controller, a controller instead, and we'll have the view defined inside of our static directory, inside of our repository directory as well. I want you to take note of that. However, I just want to keep things to the bare minimal. Yeah, definitely I can see demonstrate how we can log in through the Keycloak server using authorization group code grant type. That is for that. And if we were to take a close look at our security config, now we've made a couple of changes. So I'll take out this import of the value annotation at the top. You can see that for now we only have this configuration right here. Let me pretty much separate this to get to see a proper view of it. And we simply are stating that any request should be authenticated, but we are yet to provide the valid way user is going to log in. And to do that, we are simply going to make use of the OAuth2 login instance or the OAuth2 login method of our client. So this should be OAuth2 login. I want to pass in an OAuth2 service instance, and by default we can simply put something in like this, or customizer with default. Let me correct this. Okay, so we can simply go ahead with this, and it's automatically going to redirect us to our Keycloak login page. But one thing I want to quickly point out is that with this kind of configuration, we will be unable to, get the roles or the authorities associated with the user. So we have to go ahead and define something similar to our JWT converter, but in this case, we are going to be defining a custom OIDC user service. But before we do that, I want to quickly take a close look at our applications.properties file. Now, in the case of a client, that's a Spring Oauth2 client, there are a couple of configurations we want to include inside of our application.properties file. And since in our scenario, authorization server is Keycloak, it's not like the well-known other kind of authorization server like Google or GitHub, as the case may be. So there are a couple of configurations that we have to implement. And because of that, I'll be changing the name of the file, or perhaps the type of our application file, from a simple properties file to a YAML file. So this should be YML. I'll simply refactor. I want to copy the whole of this and paste in this YAML configuration. So we have our server port running on 8081, and we have the name of our application. Now let's go through all of this. Firstly, we've specified Spring Security Oauth2 client properties, and the next thing is the registration, and we have Keycloak. Okay, now the provider is Keycloak. Our client ID is simply the ID of our client we have, and we can as well specify a client secret. But in our own scenario, we didn't define any client secret in our Keycloak realm. Okay, and now we specify the authorization grant type, which happens to be authorization code, and the scope is OpenID, and our redirect URL should simply be the redirect URL we've defined inside of our IO codes client when we created it. And we can see that our base URL would be localhost 8081. That's HTTP localhost 8081. Then we want to place it at the /login/oauth2, then /code, followed by the name of whatever provider you are making use of. Okay. And now our username attribute is the preferred username. This is needed because the subject gotten from the token is simply a random string, and we want to simply get the username, which happens to be gotten from the preferred username claims inside of our JWT token. And finally, we have this provider directly inside of the client detail and not under registration. Take note of where I've defined this value. So we have the provider, and here we have Keycloak, after which we have our issuer URL, and this is very, very important. So now we can go ahead now and create our custom OIDC user service. Now we will have a new custom OIDC user service, okay, as a class, and we are going to be annotating with at service, just like we annotated our converter with at component. Well, practically the same thing. And this service class will extend the default OIDC user service class that Spring Security makes use of. Okay, so right here there is just a single method from this OIDC user service class that we want to override. I'll open this class so we can take a close look at that method, and that method is the load user method. So we want to override this and provide another default users for our application. So we'll move back and we annotate our method with at override, and it should be public. and it returns. Let's see what it returns right here. I'll simply just okay, an OIDC user. So I just highlight the whole of this, Control C, and move back. I will paste it here, Control V. Okay. For us to at first get the attribute from this OIDC user, we want to get an instance of OIDC user at first. And I'll simply say OIDC user. This should be equal to super.load user. And we're going to pass in our user request and type that in. So right here, we want to get an attribute from our user. That attribute is of type list and should be string, just like we did with the authorities from our JWT token when we were looking at the resource demo application not long ago. So this should be authorities. It should be equal to OIDC user.get attribute. Okay, and here we are going to pass in authorities. Okay, now that we've gotten this authority, we want to create a set of granted authority. So this should be granted authority, and this should be, or sorry, my bad, granted authority, new hash set. I'll type that in, and I'll have to import these classes. Now if authorities is not equal to null, just like we have it, we have to ensure that we are checking. I want to map through the value of authorities, so this should be dot for each. Okay, we are going to have an authority, and then we want to simply get rid of granted authorities dot add new simple granted authority. Then I'll type that in. We'll have to import that as well. So this is basically what we need. And finally, we have to return our default OIDC user. So this should be return new default OIDC user. We pass in our authority as first, and that should be granted authorities. And we're going to get our token, which should be OIDC user dot get ID token. And finally, we want to pass in the user info, which should be OIDC user dot get user info. So that is it. Now that we've defined this service, let's close this and see. Okay, we'll have a proper view of it now. Our OIDC user, we loaded it from our super class, and then we got the attributes, that is the authorities attributes from the OIDC user. We set a new granted authorities to hash set, and after we should check if our attributes, if our authorities is not null, and we mark through it, and then we return a default OIDC user that will be used by our application. So in order for us to use this, we also have to inject it directly inside of Spring security config class or application config class. So this should be at to wired. Right now we're going to have a private OIDC user service, and it should be custom OIDC user service. Now in place of customizer with default, I want to implement what initially was on my mind. So we should have OAuth2, should be OAuth2 dot user info endpoint. And right here we're going to pass in user info .oidc user service, and I want to pass in our custom OIDC user service. And I'll take out this part. Okay. Now with this configuration in place, we have successfully implemented a Spring Oauth2 client. So we'll go ahead now and start up our demo application. So I'll click on this run icon so it runs. And I hope my Keycloak instance is still active. So I'll reload. Okay, I'll have to access my console again. Okay. Okay, and right here our application is up and running. So moving to the browser again, we want to move on to the slash hello endpoint at first. So this should be localhost 8081 slash hello, and we'll be asked to sign in. I want to provide the details for IOCode admin user, after which we simply go ahead and sign in. You can see that if I'm to move back a bit, oops, my bad. Let me go to hello. Okay. I'd love to open this in a new Chrome profile. I want to explain something now. So let me go to my normal user profile. I'm going to have on localhost 8081 slash hello. Okay. So now at first we have our realms, and all of this is simply the issuer URL at first. The issuer URL at first. We have the protocol to open/openid slash auth, and now we are providing a couple of parameters. Okay, firstly is the response type, which is code. Then we have the client ID, we have the scope, we have the state, and we also have our redirect URI. Okay, initially we set the redirect URI when we were creating our clients to be this as the base URI, and then we included an asterisk to indicate that whatever follows will be acceptable, and that is why we define this extra value. So by default, this is how you define it for Keycloak. Okay, so with all of this in place, we can go ahead now and make use of the IO codes user in this scenario, followed by the password to log in at this particular Chrome profile. Now I want to visit the the person's endpoint of our 8081, and we can see that we have a 4.0 bidding as the return status. Let me close this. But in the case of my second Chrome profile, I've simply gone ahead and previously logged in with the admin details. So when I click on it, we have the details of a person sent back as the response object. Now with all of this in place, we have been able to see how to configure a OAuth2 resource server, as well as a Spring Oauth2 client application with Keycloak. And for the resource server, we looked at how to get our access token using a password grant type. And in the case of this client, we've gotten a token using the authorization code grant type that redirects us to our Keycloak server, and we authenticate from there, and it redirects us back to our application to the particular page we want to view. We can as well get the token using the authorization code grant type for a resource server application. So all you have to do is implement what I previously implemented in my Spring Boot OAuth2 authorization server video. And just to give you a proper illustration of what I'm trying to say, I'll have to open Notepad, and right at this very spot, we have the whole of this configuration. So what I'm trying to say is that you firstly provide the client ID, just like we saw just now, and the client and the response type, and you'll be redirected, but with an authorization code, and you copy that code and move over to Postman and send a request to the token endpoint with that code. Okay, so that is that. Now, one final note, we can see that the configuration for a client and for a resource server doesn't differ too much. The configuration is still almost similar, with the custom OIDC user service as an alternative to the JWT custom converter. So with all of this stated, that pretty much brings us to the end of this Keycloak tutorial. If you love this video and you find it interesting, please do well to subscribe to this channel and also give this video a thumbs up to help the YouTube algorithm. Thank you, and until the next one, keep being your best self. Peace out.